Good afternoon, everyone. My name's Steven Zelkowitz, and as a member of the AJC Executive Council, I'm pleased to welcome you to this concurrent session of the Global Forum, otherwise known as Lunch and Learn about Putin and Russia. I can tell that from the size of the crowd, this is a boring and non-controversial topic that nobody's thinking much about these days. A little more than a quarter century ago, shortly after the fall of the Iron Curtain in Eastern Europe, the Soviet Union collapsed, and it splintered into several republics. Many around the world optimistically believed that with the end of the Cold War, Russia would join with the West in embracing democracy, capitalism, individual freedom, and the rule of law. There was also a seriously held view back in those days that we had literally reached the end of history, in the sense that the Western model of liberal democracy and economic capitalism had prevailed and there were no viable alternative governmental or economic systems. Well, those hopeful and optimistic days seem long ago now. Russia has not exactly become a peace-loving representative democracy. It is dominated by Vladimir Putin, who has no serious or permissible political opposition. President Putin, who famously called the collapse of the Soviet Union, and I quote, a major geopolitical disaster of the century, has demonstrated a desire to restore Russia's place on the world stage and revive its dominance over the former Soviet republics and perhaps the former puppet states in Eastern Europe, several of which are now members of both NATO and the European Union. In the past 5 years, we've seen the annexation of Crimea, the invasion of eastern Ukraine, and diplomatic and military support for the murderous Assad regime in Syria. And for months now, our press conference here in the US and also in Europe has been dominated by revelations of Russian interference in our recent presidential elections and also elections in Europe, including most recently France. All this now being investigated by congressional committees and our national security agencies. The purpose of this interference apparently is to sow chaos among Western liberal democracies. What is Putin after, and how does he intend to achieve his goals? Should the United States aggressively seek to stop him, or attempt to establish some sort of cooperative modus vivendi? Today, we're privileged to have with us three distinguished experts on Russian policy, and I'm sure they're all going to be in total agreement with one another, so it'll be a boring discussion. But they'll address these thorny issues, and I'm sure we'll have a lively and active discussion and participation. First, let me introduce Professor Stephen Cohn, Professor Emeritus at NYU, my alma mater, and Princeton. He has frequently visited and lived in Soviet and post-Soviet Russia, and his newest book, Why the Cold War Again? How America Lost Post-Soviet Russia, will be published this fall. Julia Yaffe is a staff writer for The Atlantic. She was born in Moscow in the twilight of the Soviet Union and lived there until her family fled to the US in 1990. She has written for many publications, including The New Yorker, The Times Magazine, Foreign Policy, and The New Republic. Finally, Andrew Weiss is Vice President for Studies at the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace, overseeing research on Russia and Eurasia. He was Director for Russian, Ukrainian, and Eurasian Affairs on the National Security Council under President Clinton, and served in the State and Defense Departments in the Clinton and George H.W. Bush administrations. The panel will be moderated by Aron Isaacson, AJC Associate Director for Policy and Director of its Office of Government and International Affairs, and your title gets longer every time I see you, Jason. Jason, I'm sure everyone's waiting for the panel to start, so let's just kick it off.
Okay, just give us a second to wire ourselves up here. Good afternoon, those of you in the front row who just heard me. Steve, thank you for that introduction. I think the best starting point for a conversation with three distinguished experts on Russia is the series of short questions that Steve just posed. What is Vladimir Putin after? How does he intend to achieve his goals? Should the United States seek to stop him? Alternatively, can we find some modus vivendi for U.S.-Russian cooperation? And to those questions, I believe it is necessary, in light of the months of saturation coverage of Russia references and Russia's role in the U.S. presidential election, to add a couple of further questions. Not only what is Vladimir Putin after, but what is Donald Trump after? And is there a constituency in Washington, not only in the White House, but in Congress and in the national security establishment, to look past a long list of transgressions and abuses and actually embrace Russia? Let's begin with the initial questions. Professor Cohen, I'd like to start with you. You've spoken and written a good deal in recent years about the justifications for Russia's behavior in Ukraine and Crimea and elsewhere, and you've suggested it's U.S. and Western provocation at least as much as, if not more than, Russian action that has brought us to what you've described now as a new Cold War. So let me ask you, what is Vladimir Putin after? How does he intend to achieve his goals? And what do you see as the prospect of U.S.-Russian cooperation?
We got sound, right?
Yes.
And you have 30 seconds to answer that.
Oh, 30?
No.
Yes, no, and maybe. So I'm here, obviously, as the outlier. Some of you may know me as Putin's best friend in America or Putin's apologist. It's not true. But I think it's necessary to remember which of us is the Cohen up here and who prevails in tribal authority. And I may evoke that as we go on. I also want to say, to establish my credentials, that I alone, perhaps, was bar mitzvahed in a small Kentucky town on the Ohio River in a tiny temple founded by Stephen Weiss himself. We had no rabbi, but the rabbi came all the way from the Hebrew Union College in Cincinnati just to bar mitzvah me. I didn't want to be bar mitzvahed as the only Jew in town, but my father said I had to because he's coming from Cincinnati on a raft, and it was very dangerous. Later I learned he came on the train like everybody else. So I have some kosher credentials. Let me answer your question by just generally stating my position, because it relates to your question and to what was said before by Stephen. Correct, Steve? I obviously do not agree fully with what Steve said, and it's important to have a discussion in this day, and the broader the better. Let me make my three heresies as a Cohen clear. We're in a new and more dangerous Cold War. This is a history that began probably with the end of the Soviet Union. It's much more dangerous than the preceding one. And I believe that if we assign responsibility in terms of policy, the United States is probably somewhere in the area of 80% responsible. And Russia's unwise reaction to us about 20%. I don't know if you can quantify these things, but just for the sake of argument. The second point is that in the world in which we live, and today I'm thinking about terrorism, as we all are, whoever's in the Kremlin is our most natural national security partner, essential. But we ruled that out in the terms of Putin. I come to Putin now, because we vilified and demonized him in a way that we can't think clearly about him. By the way, Oliver Stone's 4 hours of interviews with Putin, more than I think any interview has ever had for film, begins on Showtime, I think, next week. And so we can watch Putin for 4 hours and see if anything he says or does changes our mind. But part of the problem is that we've so demonized him, we can't say, is he a national security partner in the way that Eisenhower thought Khrushchev was, Nixon thought Brezhnev was, Reagan thought Gorbachev was. And the final point I would make is that we have now an additional problem. For many people, the combination of Putin and Trump is simply toxic beyond any rational discussion. So when we have Trump in the White House and Putin in the Kremlin, and I didn't put Trump in the White House and I didn't put Putin in the Kremlin, and yet I think that cooperation, above all on terrorism, is imperative. And I think this thing called Russiagate which I personally think there's almost nothing to, has become an obstacle to any serious diplomatic negotiations, though they're obviously trying, that we really have a very serious, maybe existential problem. And that's where I stand on the Putin question and what we should do.
And the question about what he is after?
Well, I'm a historian and also I wrote biography. When a person comes to power and has been in power 16 years or even less, their goals change. So I know what his mission was when he came to power in 2000. Russia was a state that had collapsed twice in the 20th century. There's no precedent for this in the revolution and again 1991. So his mission was to restore a stable Russia that would never again collapse. Now he has different missions, but I would say the minimum goal is he wants absolutely no military bases on Russia's borders. And I would go on to say that's not unreasonable. We wouldn't tolerate it either. We had the Monroe Doctrine. We'd go ballistic if a Chinese-Russian alliance appeared in Mexico or Canada. That's his minimum goal, I would say. Then he begins to negotiate. I don't find him an aberrant or unusual in Russia's tradition leader. 20th century, I mean, he obviously wants a prosperous Russia, a high-tech Russia, a well-educated Russia, a Russia that is a world power. Let me end with this. Stop and think. All of us can remember 3 years ago. In the 90s, a very prominent, I won't mention his name, Washington figure wrote that we live in a world without Russia. It was Tom Graham. Big famous article, you remember that? That Russia didn't matter anymore. Then we got to 2014 and Obama said Russia was merely a regional power. Then after Ukraine, we said Russia's a threat to Europe. And now we're saying Russia hijacked our democracy. And now we have McCain and others saying Russia's a greater threat than ISIS. So Russia has gone from the 90s of zero consequence to us to back where it was in my old Cold War. Am I the oldest person in the room? Maybe not. You all remember this. To this #1 existential threat. Is that all because of Putin? Or have we done something? Have we changed our thinking? Have we provoked something that's not good for the world? So Putin evolves with the world.
Thank you, Steve. Julia, pick up on this if you would.
I was just going to say, I think we should all say Sheikhianu because I find myself agreeing with a lot of what Steve said. This doesn't happen a lot. So I actually just got back from a long reporting trip to Russia, and I found that Russians are looking back more than ever to their history. And 2017 is a big year for Russia. This year marks the 100th anniversary of the Bolshevik Revolution. Actually, 2 revolutions happened in 1917. First, the abdication of Tsar Nicholas II in the spring, and then in the fall, the Bolshevik Revolution. And last year was the 25th anniversary of the Soviet collapse. So as Steve said, 2 major collapses in the span of 100 years. And Russians, thanks to official efforts and Kremlin propaganda efforts, are very aware of the possibility of collapse, of the dangers of collapse, of the bloody, chaotic consequences of collapse. And they'd like to avoid it. Also, in looking back toward their history, and with the renaissance of the Russian Orthodox Church, there's this kind of thinking about what Russia is and where it's going. More than, they're not thinking about what Putin wants, what Putin, this is us. We need somebody, one person to focus on. There's a lot of thinking about what Russia is. And there's a lot of reaching back to history, to Byzantium, to thinking of Russia as the Third Rome, and seeing a Russia that has always been an empire, that has always been punching above its geopolitical weight, trying to be at the table with the European powers in the 18th century, in the 19th century, in the 20th century, and now. So in some ways, what happened in the 9 years between the Soviet collapse and Putin's ascent to power in 2000 was a macro-historical blip. And what we're seeing now is Russia coming back into its historical, natural position. And I think, listening to the introduction here, I was thinking that if I were a Russian hearing this, it would really, as the Russian saying goes, it would really cut my ears. Because what's wrong with, from the Russian perspective, what's wrong with defending your interests? What's wrong with having your interests argued for strongly, robustly on the world stage? Why should you be a zero? Why should America dominate, and why shouldn't Russia's voice be taken into account? And so the other anniversary that is being marked this year in Russia, far more than the other two, which are very inconvenient for Putin and are being kind of ignored, at least on official channels. The one anniversary of note this year was the 10th anniversary of Vladimir Putin's 2007 speech at the Munich Security Conference, in which he, for the first time, laid out his vision, his geopolitical vision for Russia, which is the Cold War ended and there was one clear winner, but it was not a natural state of the world. That a unipolar world, as he put it, it's not good for the world, and it's not good for the sovereign nation that's calling all the shots in the world without consulting with anybody else. So he has been, for the last 10 years, that's been the goal, is to make sure that America is not the only one calling the shots. And of course, he's saying this is 2007. He's saying this with Joe Lieberman and John McCain and Lindsey Graham sitting in the front row. This is 4 years after the invasion of Iraq, which had been falling apart already by 2007. And he's saying, you keep not listening to us. And I heard this over and over again on this trip to Russia. You keep not listening to us. We told you, don't go into Iraq. You went into Iraq. It's a disaster, and it's a disaster that keeps on giving. We told you, don't go into Libya. Look what you've done to Libya. We told you, don't support color revolutions, because you don't know, maybe you don't like these dictators, but you don't know what comes after them. I'm giving you the Russian version of this. I'm not saying I fully subscribe to this. And look at what happened to Syria. Of course, a lot of this is self-fulfilling prophecy, right? Putin sees himself in a lot of this, that he is the head of an increasingly personalized state. So Russians are also looking forward. Next year is the presidential election. Putin has not declared that he is running, but he's of course running, and he's of course going to win a fourth presidential term, which is now 6 years instead of 4. The Russians amended the constitution in 2008 or 9, I believe. So that fourth term will run out in 2024 when he'll be 72. Now, about 2/3 of Russian men don't live past the age of 60. He's going to be turning 65 in October. He'll be 72 at the end of this term. What is he going to do? Is he going to amend the Constitution again? Does he have a successor? Does he have an exit strategy? And there's a reason that Vladimir Putin so sympathizes and actually not sympathizes, empathizes, and sees himself in strongmen like Mubarak, like Assad, like Gaddafi, whose death he was obsessed with, by the way. I heard from many people inside Russia and in the US government who dealt with him at the time that he was obsessively watching the video of Gaddafi's very public, humiliating death over and over and over again. He was watching the videos of Saddam Hussein's trial and execution over and over and over again. He was obsessed with this, and he sees himself in these leaders. So he's, in some ways, what you have to realize about Putin is he's also kind of a hostage to the system he's created. He came to power at a time when Russia was chaotic and many of the institutions of the state had fallen apart, except for the security services. And he has increasingly personalized these systems, made them work for him. So when the head of his party came out and said in 2014 that if there is Putin, there is Russia, and if there is Russia, there is Putin, equating Russia and Putin, what happens when Putin dies or he leaves power? He is mortal. I mean, I think Americans think of him as this, 18-foot tall boogeyman. He's omniscient. He's omnipotent. He's the perfect villain. He is capable of plotting and executing these perfect, intricate plans, which I think makes every Russian laugh. What happens when he's done? What comes after Putin? And the longer he's in power, the more he personalizes the state, the more the more he has to stay there, and the more the danger grows that after he's gone comes chaos.
Let me, though, go back to one point that Steve addressed. In light of everything you've just said, and you've packed a lot in, what do you see as the possibility for cooperation between the United States and Russia? That could take hours, I know.
So this is hard because, as Steve correctly said, Russia evolves just as we evolve. And, you know, it's on one hand, he's been in power 17 years, and now he's on his third American administration, and on his, I've lost count how many secretaries of state American secretaries of state he's dealt with. So we've evolved, he's evolved. So it's not a static question, right? And Lord knows every administration has tried. They've all come in saying, first Bush, then Obama, now Trump, all think we're going to work with Russia. Mm-hmm. And they often say we're going to work with them on counterterrorism. But then they quickly realize that Russia means something totally different when they talk about counterterrorism. When they talk about counterterrorism, they mean propping up Assad. They're not really going after ISIS. In fact, I was just down in Dagestan, which is a Muslim republic inside Russia in the south. When I lived in Russia from 2009 to 2012, I wouldn't have dreamt of going to Dagestan because there was at least a terrorist attack a day. It was extremely violent. There was a violent Islamist insurgency happening there. It had been pushed out from Chechnya. And now it was completely quiet. The Kafkas Emirate, which was the main insurgent organization that had been dismantled because everybody's in Syria. Russian is now the second most spoken language in ISIS. There's there's about 10, estimates vary, but I've heard up to 10,000 Russian speakers in ISIS. And it's interesting that Russia's not fighting them. And moreover, a lot of those people who went to join ISIS, who went to Syria, were aided by the Russian state, either before the Sochi Olympics, when Russia was very concerned about terrorism because of Sochi's proximity to these restive regions. The Kremlin essentially opened up a green corridor and said, we'll turn a blind eye, you get out of here. The second they cross the border out of Russia, they open a criminal case against them. Now there's a law working its way through the Russian parliament to take away their citizenship. I'm going on and on and on. But they're feeding ISIS while at the same time they're saying, let's work on counterterrorism. They're not actually fighting ISIS on the ground. So we have to, define the terms carefully. Sure, we all want to work on counterterrorism, and tellingly, after every single terrorist attack in the West, Putin makes sure to reach out and say, we feel your pain. Russia has experienced some horrific terrorist attacks, and it's true, Russia has a really bloody history, terrible history with terrorism. And let's work together, and you need our help. You need us. Bring us in from the cold. Stop sanctioning us. Let's work together against terrorism. The problem is they're helping feed the beast that then pops up in Europe.
Thank you. Andrew, I'd like to maybe move in a slightly different direction, unless you would like to weigh in on what Putin is after. So amid all the positive messages that candidate and then President Donald Trump sent toward Moscow over many months, there was also a sharply critical tone adopted by the White House after the Syrian chemical attack in Idlib province, the attack that led to the U.S. missile strike on a Syrian airbase. The Secretary of State Tillerson observed either Russia has been complicit or Russia has been simply incompetent. Of course, it was just a month after Tillerson spoke that Foreign Minister Lavrov was sitting with President Trump in the Oval Office. How would you describe U.S.-Russia relations today, and the possibility of cooperation on counterterrorism? Is the difficulty as severe as Julia has just suggested?
No, well, thanks for having me. And I should stipulate that having grown up in a nearly all Jewish community in Beverly Hills, I was probably the only kid who wasn't bar mitzvahed. So I feel a little bit.
No trains, no rafts brought rabbis to your
nothing,
door? Okay.
Nothing. So, anyways, very secular family. But the question you pose about sort of Russia's role in Syria and the counterterrorism discussion, which Julia and Steve touched upon, I think there's a couple of basic facts we should put on the table. First of all, as Julia said, Russia went to Syria not to fight the threat of global terrorism personified in ISIS, but to ensure that the Assad regime didn't fall. And there was a real fear in the summer of 2015 that Assad was close to falling. They came in and they filled a vacuum. The United States clearly did not seek to get more involved militarily at the end of the Obama administration. They had defined fairly limited goals, and I'd say up to now the Trump administration, despite some of the big rhetoric, has sort of kept to that playbook of not wanting the US involved too much on the ground, to focus on attacking ISIL leadership, to going after a few symbolic places like Mosul and Raqqa where ISIL is deeply entrenched, but they're not looking to have a new Iraq-style ground war. And so far we've had a bit of a division of labor with the Russians where we're focused on that particular piece, and the Russian military activities are concentrated in other geographical regions of Syria. But the endpoint, which the Russians have had in mind, I think, is to basically limit our options to do more. So the Russians throughout this period have built a significant anti-aircraft set of capabilities throughout Syria, which are called A2AD access, anti-access area denial, which means that literally US planes fly there at the sufferance of the Russians. And if things ever get worse and we suddenly needed to do more, taking out those sites would involve great risk because it would potentially involve dropping weapons on these Russian facilities, which would kill Russian soldiers. Right. And so that's a very dangerous kind of escalatory approach, which the United States up to now has been trying very carefully to avoid. So the other piece, which I think we also have to put on the table, is that going back, and I can remember when I was at the White House being in these very small group discussions with Putin himself about fighting terrorism, this inherently relies on there being trust and established mechanisms for sharing information between our intelligence services. That trust doesn't exist. It largely hasn't existed for a long time. The problems predate the problems that were created by Russia's brazen interference in our election. But to do that kind of work also requires a common approach to fighting terrorism. And in the US case, we have adopted a very surgical approach. People can criticize and come up with all sorts of critiques of the US approach to fighting terrorism, but the Russian approach has largely been about blunt force. And so they don't go after people the way we do around the world. And they also don't see global terrorism as the threat. Their main concern has been the threat of losing parts of Russia's territory, like Chechnya or Dagestan, to radical Islamists. So there's a definitional challenge that's baked into this problem, and the lack of trust is corrosive. So in the wake of Russia's interference in our election, the idea that DOD or the CIA are going to sort of want to sit down with their Russian counterparts and share sensitive information that either potentially inhibits our ability to collect such information in the future or gives up some of the techniques we use to target and actually surgically attack the leaders of terrorist organizations, to me seems really, really improbable. What is, I think, deeply troubling, and this comes to the question about the Trump administration approach, was, I think, a fixation going to the wake of the Orlando bombing, the Orlando attack, that somehow Russia is our natural partner. And Steve sort of alluded to this, that, you know, like, if we could get things right with the Russians, all these other great things would fall into place. I think that is just strategically inaccurate, and Trump and Mike Flynn keep using that throughout the campaign, and then when they come into office, as a guiding, motivating priority for their administration. It's latched on to other sort of really grandiose geopolitical ideas, which I think are equally faulty. So for example, when we hear about these apparent calls that happened between senior representatives of the Trump campaign and representatives of the Russian government during the December-January timeframe, two of the other issues they're talking about are, can we pry Russia away from Iran? Can we somehow team up with Russia to more intensively isolate hegemonic Iran? The other construct is, can we use Russia as a tool to contain China? These are their phrasings. And in Bill Clinton's terminology, that dog will not hunt. And these have been sort of animating factors, I think, behind what we've seen throughout the Trump administration, which is a very grandiose, kind of over-exaggerated view of Russia. I think the dangers that Steve outlined at the beginning of the US and Russia being potentially in some form of confrontation are real. I think there are very few rules. There are very few channels of cooperation or communication. I've never in my professional career seen the US-Russia relationship this bad. And I think the real challenge for anyone in government at this point is not to like look for some magic formula or genie in a bottle that's going to make the US and Russia get along again.
So hard to work together.
It's to manage this dangerous competition
Okay.
and confrontation.
Hard to work together, can't really manipulate them, can't subjugate them, and they don't, and the security establishments don't talk to each other. Or
And
do in a
talking
very limited way.
deliberately talking trash or trying to ignore Russia or kind of rub Russia's nose in the dirt is also a self-defeating strategy.
Julie, you wanted to jump
Yeah,
in,
I just
think.
wanted to underscore what Andrew was saying, that it's not just the intelligence agencies, it's also just, you know, the Foreign Ministry and State Department, the DOD and the Ministry of Defense, the whole structures under President X and Vladimir Putin don't trust the other side. And knowing, for example, that the American foreign policy and defense establishment and structures hate the Russians, that this is in part why they're trying to establish a direct line to Trump, to Jared Kushner, to Michael Flynn, trying to have somebody who would help them bypass the American foreign policy and defense structures, because they know that how much they are opposed naturally to the Russians.
Professor, can Washington and Moscow cooperate in the way that you've urged in the past without lifting the U.S. sanctions against Russia? And do you see those sanctions being lifted in the absence of Russian withdrawal from eastern Ukraine and Crimea, which is even remotely possible?
They can cooperate, and the sanctions, the American sanctions are symbolic, they don't matter. It's the European sanctions that matter. Let me remind you that Jackson Vanik, you all know what Jackson Vanik was? Sure. Right?
Scoop Jackson.
Yeah, I'd said that the Soviet Union could not trade with the United States on favorable terms until they let the Jews go. That stayed on the books after the end of the Soviet Union, and when more Jews were going to Russia than were leaving. So once you get these sanctions, which are easy to put on and politically feel good and become political balls in a game, it's very hard to remove them. The American sanctions, except the foolish thing that Obama did at the end in illegally seizing property. Those compounds are private Russian property, and we've got two in Russia, and the Russians say, give them back or we'll take yours, and threatening a cyber attack against Russia, which was reckless. Let's leave all that aside. I think for me, if we're going to talk about what seems to me to be the number one threat to all of us and our kids, and not only us, international terrorism, the détente between Julian and myself, which was very short-lived but remarkable. I was going to say, if Julia Joffe and Stephen Cohen can have a détente, surely Trump and Putin can sort it out, and they should just send the two of us to do the work for them, but it didn't quite work out. There's a fundamental issue here, and I think Andrew and Julia represent the prevailing Washington mainstream view, which I think is empirically, conceptually, fundamentally wrong, and this has to do with our security. We can't have, they say, a counterterrorism or anti-terrorism alliance with Russia because Russia doesn't really fight terrorism in Syria. It just went to keep Assad in power. That's a conceptual misunderstanding. They also say that we can't do it because the CIA and DOD are against it. And we know this to be true. About this, it's correct. We know in 2016, we know this is a fact. Leave aside the 51 diplomats who broke all precedent at the State Department and came out and publicly protested Obama negotiating with Putin for some cooperation in Syria. You recall that episode? No precedent for it in American history, I know. And then, when Obama and Putin agree on a limited intelligence sharing in Syria, DOD violated the arrangements by killing 80 Syrian soldiers and sabotaged it. And the CIA has been leaking since July 2016 against Trump. Why, I don't know, but one guess is they don't like Trump's idea. Wouldn't it be great to cooperate with Russia? So we know there's this opposition, and that's why we have political leaderships. Let me remind you of a little history. Every major détente we've had has been conducted by a Republican president. Eisenhower, Nixon, and Reagan. And if any of you were around when Reagan, quote, betrayed his Cold War history and met Gorbachev halfway, his own Secretary of State, Caspar Weinberger, said, I quit. Were you around? You remember that one, Cappy? And we remember what Reagan said? Cappy, we're going to miss you around here. Because Reagan had made up his mind and he went forward. So there is powerful opposition. And there's opposition in Moscow to this arrangement, too, I agree. Leaders do. Here's the fundamental question. And Putin told this to Megyn Kelly last night, but she didn't have the slightest idea what he was talking about. She did this kind of interview. She was going to a question, she didn't hear the answers. There was no real follow-up. And so she didn't really interrogate him about fundamental questions.
Well, he's not easy to interrogate.
Yes, he is. He's very discussione, Chilean. He talks. He's watching, he answers questions. You know, maybe don't agree, but he gives his answer. Here's the Russian point of view, and it's not just Putin, but it's the Russian security class, and I find it compelling. The terrorism we're dealing with today is not your grandfather's or your father's terrorism. It's not those lone terrorists who killed Russian czars. It's not the Jews who killed the British in Palestine. It's not the cuckoo who goes out and kills. This is organized terrorism. They control territories. They have aspects of statehood. They have bank accounts. They have resources. They have infrastructure. They have an ideology that gives them boundless recruits. This is something new. The primary risk is when the state collapses in a place like the Middle East, as happened in Iraq, as happened in Libya. And it's even worse when the United States decides it's going to decapitate those states. And then you give these terrorists territory, recruits, oil, resources. For 3 years prior to when Putin decided to intervene in Syria in September 2015, Obama said he was fighting ISIS. Go back and look at those 3 years. All ISIS did was take more territory in Iraq and Syria. That's a fact. We were not fighting anybody except the foes of Assad. And we got testimony from the CIA in front of Congress. One guy finally said for $500 million or $1 billion, he thought there were 5 people there fighting. They were funding people who couldn't fight anybody, who had aims that were not consistent with anti-terrorism, some of which were terrorists themselves, Al-Qaeda and derivatives. So Putin's argument is this, and he said this to Obama publicly, and he said it to the UN twice, and he says it all the time. You, Andrew and Julia, tell me, decapitate the Syrian state, and what do you imagine? And I tell you, you have an existential choice. It is either Assad in Damascus, or it's the Islamic State. At the moment, if we don't have the Syrian army, and when you destroy the state, you lose the army, half those guys will go join the Islamic State. Who's going to put the boots on the ground? We're not going to send boots on the ground, Russia. Some special ops. Is the United States going to put boots on the ground? No. If we don't have the Syrian army fighting, who's going to do the fighting? Answer that question, Putin says, over and over and over again. And our answer is, well, but you're bolstering Assad. And his answer is, no, we're saving the Syrian state. We don't care about Assad down the road. We need the Syrian state. And to end this story, it is a fact that the Islamic State was pumping oil out of Syria and shipping it to Turkey for years and funding the army. And the Russians repeatedly showed our intel, look at the pictures. Take those trucks out. And we did nothing. And then in September 2015, the Russian Air Force came in and decimated that supply line that was funding the Islamic State. Is that apologetics for Putin? No. That's an apologetics for American national security. So the bottom line is, and let me remind you, the Russians talk about mistrust. The Russians told the FBI and the CIA in Moscow, and then again in Washington, about the Tsarnaev brother. You remember the guy who blew the Boston Marathon? Mm-hmm. What did the FBI do? They sent somebody to his mother, and she said he's a wonderful boy. And they said, okay, did they surveil him? No. Did they tap him? No. Did they follow him to the hardware store where he and his brother were buying the stuff to build the bomb? No. Russian intelligence, however malevolent it can be, really knows this world because they're part of it. How many Islamic citizens does Russia have? About 17 million, roughly?
About
15?
20.
20. Well, they breed faster than Russians, right? That's part of the problem. No, that's part of the problem. It's not a joke. So Russia's part of this world. Their intelligence, they got more embedded agents in these terror. And it's good that there are all these Russians fighting there because half of them are, some percentage of them are informers. We need Russian intelligence to protect us.
Thank you.
And we need a Syrian state that can fight unless you guys feel we should send Americans over there to do it. We're talking 40, 50,000 Americans.
Thank you,
It's
Professor.
going to happen.
I'm trying to feel protected. Julia, please jump in.
So let's work backwards through that. First of all, I shouldn't have wasted time telling you guys about the Russian perspective. You have it here. No, I mean, it's a very clear, concise summary of what you'll hear in official Russian circles. It's this, these are the arguments that Russians will put forward. About the Tsarnaev brothers, yes, the FSB did tip off the FBI about the Tsarnaev brothers. The problem is that they lived in America, which has laws very different than the Russian Federation, where you can't just tap somebody's phone and you can't just follow them to the hardware store. And these, unfortunately, are just some of the risks.
Here or there, you mean?
Here.
We have different laws.
We do have different laws.
We can't tap phones.
I'm saying there are procedures to tap phones.
I know, but we don't tap phones here.
That's not what I said.
They could have.
That's not what I said. Let me finish. I didn't interrupt you.
I know,
Okay.
but they could have gotten a tap.
The point is, also, the Russians aren't that great at dealing with terrorism. For a long time, the way they dealt with terrorism domestically was so harsh and so ham-fisted and sledgehammer. It was the sledgehammer approach that bred more and more terrorism. There's a reason. It's not just the large Muslim population of Russia that there are so many people fighting in Syria. The other question is, I just fundamentally don't agree that ISIS is the biggest threat to the U.S. If anything, Russia's a far, far bigger threat to the U.S. What is ISIS going to do? They're going to kill a few dozen people here and a few dozen people there? That's horrible, but they don't have nuclear weapons like Russia. They don't have a massive ground army like Russia. They don't have an air force. They don't have, fundamentally, Russia is an existential threat to the U.S., not ISIS. ISIS is not, and never has been, and never will be an existential threat to the U.S. And when you, when was this? About a year and a half ago, I was in a refugee camp in Germany talking to Syrian refugees. There was not a single refugee there who had been fleeing ISIS territory. They were all fleeing Assad's territory. ISIS exists because Assad exists. Terrorism in Syria exists because Assad exists, and propping up Assad feeds the terrorism beast inside Syria. The other thing is that it's a self-fulfilling prophecy. The longer you run a police state, the weaker institutions you're going to have, the weaker your civil society is, the less there's going to be anybody capable of picking up the baton when time comes to pass it. Even if you don't decapitate these regimes externally, which I agree is not a good idea, and it's dangerous and it unleashes all kinds of unpredictable forces. Even when you don't decapitate them externally, they're all run by mortal men, and eventually they all die. And even when they die their own natural deaths, they're not unchaotic. I just think you're basing things on a lot of logical fallacies.
Let me turn in a different direction. I want to come back to you, Julia, on a question about Russian meddling in the election. But before that, I want to come to you, Andrew. How nervous is Europe, particularly Central and Eastern Europe, about Russian intentions, and how confident are these governments about the U.S. ability to help in their deterrence against Russian aggression?
So I think it depends. If you're a member of NATO, there's a general understanding that this is somehow going to lead to a conflagration with the United States if Russia crosses certain lines, and that you can basically count on the United States, thanks to a series of new moves, to deploy troops in the parts of Central Europe that felt the most exposed, that have seen people like General Mattis come through in recent months and say that our rock-solid commitment to NATO is undiminished. All of those dynamics are very different if you're outside of NATO. And inside NATO, inside core NATO, there's huge questions now about whether Trump is serious about the connection between America's security and security of our European allies. And there was an article just this morning on Politico.com suggesting that Trump himself had torn out a key passage of his speech when he visited NATO headquarters last week, in which he basically
Referring to Article 5?
yeah, and that he and his senior team had struck that language from his speech.
Because McMaster last night, speaking to HAC, was
Exactly.
was more forthcoming on that point.
Exactly. So there's I think deep uncertainty and panic among especially German, British, and French officials about what does Trump really think about NATO, and does he think we're an albatross around America's neck, or is our security inextricably connected? But in any event, for the Central European governments who are going through all sorts of complicated transitions where you have a more nationalistic mood and populistic mood setting in motion bad dynamics in Poland and places like Hungary. Anyways, NATO's got problems. But if you're on the other side of the line in Moldova and Ukraine and Georgia and those countries which are most geographically close to Russia, they're
And
very
they've already
worried.
felt the Russian sting.
And we have a series of countries there which will be profoundly either unstable or profoundly weaker than Russia as far as the eye can see. So we're looking at what I think you can call a target-rich environment. To the extent the Russians seek to make trouble, they will have a lot of opportunities to do that, and they will find, particularly in the United States, a sense of, hey, that's, as we saw in Ukraine, it's terrible what happened to you. We will, condemn it. We will impose sanctions. We will work to bolster your statehood, but we're not going to go to war. And there's a great moment in the interview that Jeff Goldberg did with Obama that came out in the spring, where Obama basically says, we need to know what we're willing to go to war with Russia about. And Ukraine was a case where he wasn't prepared to go to war. So that doesn't mean that there's nothing the United States can do. When we've seen in the case of Ukraine that Ukraine has consolidated its statehood in the face of Russian aggression far more successfully than I think any of us were expecting. They built their military capabilities, and they basically now fought the Russians to a standstill in eastern Ukraine. So Putin in the Ukraine case is stuck. He doesn't have great options, but he retains tremendous amounts of leverage over what happens in Ukraine. He has the ability to escalate, he has the ability to destabilize the Ukrainian state, and to basically make this conflict go up and down in its level of intensity. That's dangerous. And what we've sort of missed from this whole conversation, Julia I think touched on it a little bit, is this is not ultimately about some big geopolitical set of ambitions that Putin, when he was elected, kind of had a checklist. I want Russia big and strong, I want no military bases, all the stuff that Steve referenced at the beginning. This is about the survival of his regime. And it's a very personalistic regime, as Julia indicated. And in 2011, and then in 2012, and in 2014, he's seen a series of events. He had street demonstrations in 2011, 2012. He had the Maidan revolution in Ukraine in 2014 that he thought were really about Russia as the next target. And that everything he's done in the subsequent period, whether it's tightening the power of the state, the crackdown on civil society, the hacking of our democracy, all of that was about pushing back and basically finding ways for Russia to use the tools that it does have at a time when Russia is far weaker than the United States to basically push the threat against Russia and against the Kremlin further back and to push us off balance. And that is the dynamic we're in. And we're dealing with a Russia which is now very audacious, which has a much higher tolerance for risk and for danger than we do. And the analogy I like to use, it's like the drunk in the bar. The drunk is now coming up to you and saying, am I bothering you? And a lot of Russia's kind of belligerence and attitude is deliberately supposed to kind of be intimidating and make us all go, no man, we're cool. And that is the dynamic we're watching. And at some point, there will be an accident, or something bad will happen, or there will be a crisis, or there'll be a flashpoint, and then we're in a whole new game where this very bad, very precarious relationship just plummets down below. And that I think is something that we should all be very worried about.
Thank you, Andrew. I'm going to go to Julia, but I want to give people a little time to ask a few questions. So let me quickly ask you a question, Julia, and then I'm going to open it up to the floor. Unless you need to respond to something that Andrew just said quickly.
I just wanted to say about NATO, I think Putin's view of NATO has also evolved. Originally it was, why does this thing still exist? It was formed in opposition to Soviet Russia. The Soviet Union no longer exists. Why does NATO still exist? We dismantled the Warsaw Pact area. Why don't you dismantle NATO? This seems like you just hate us, because of who we are. then then as NATO kind of faded more and more into irrelevance and became more of a counterterrorism alliance, especially with NATO forces going into Afghanistan, Putin, and with Obama's presidency, Putin became more tolerant of NATO. There were joint NATO-Russian military exercises. Putin allowed a NATO supply base opened on Russian territory in Ulyanovsk, which is close to Afghanistan, so allowing it to be a transit point for men and material to Afghanistan. And then after Ukraine, it again shifted, and Putin decided that it was fundamentally an anti-Russia alliance. It was coming after him, and it was slowly picking off people on the perimeter of Russia, as Andrew said, and that he was their ultimate target, and that he also believes that all these revolutions are all sponsored and created by the CIA and NED and IRI and all these NGOs, American NGOs that are allegedly pro-democracy but really are anti-Putin, and that they're all coming after him and that they're going to topple him. So this is his ultimate fear, and NATO periodically becomes the embodiment of that fear.
I think I deserve a moment of personal privilege.
Of course, Steve.
Of personal courtesy. Is that what they say at the Senate? When I said this is the way the Russian political class thinks about Syria and statehood, I said it was also my view. Julia, but she half took it back, said, well, I don't have to tell you what the Russians think because Cohen just told you, and you all laughed, as though I represent the Russian point of view. This is part of the problem with the dialogue in this country. 85% of what Andrew and Julia say, I don't believe to be factually correct. And I'm not going to sort of pick guerrilla wars with them on each point. But because an American who has some credentials, and I'm far from alone, and there are people in the agency who think exactly the way I do, exactly the way I do. There's no collective CIA. When I tell you that the Russian analysis of the Syrian situation is correct, and decapitating states endangers us, I agree, not because Putin says it. I don't care what Putin says, but I'm glad he does because they think he's right. I'm speaking to American. So it's not a good thing to say, oh, that's the Russian or Soviet point of view. When Reagan decided to accept some of Gorbachev's way of thinking about the world, he was attacked for accepting a Soviet point of view, and he said, yes, I do accept it. I'm convinced that's right, but we have our points of view. So we should stop this in this country, that anybody who says something that you disagree with, to say it's the Russian point of view. The Russians can be right. My bottom line is this. Any doctors in the room? Physicians? Good. So Julia, who's a journalist, Steve, who's a scholar, teacher, whatever, and our physicians have one thing in common. We get our facts wrong and we malpractice. What's the first oath of the physician? Do no harm. So if I come to you, you get your diagnosis right before you cut me, right? All right. The same thing for journalists. If they don't have their facts right, they're malpracticing. If I don't have my facts wrong, I'm teaching my students fake news. So if the facts aren't there, it's not for me. That's my bottom line. I think much of what they've said, there's no facts for. For example, and I'll stop here, I think there's zero facts that the Russians hacked the DNC. And yet Andrew's going on about how they hacked our democracy. Maybe they did, but nobody's produced the facts yet. When we get the facts, then we'll figure this out. But many people have told us it didn't happen.
Well, Professor,
Experts.
thank you. Let's turn to that. Thank you. So, Julia, you've written and spoken. I'm going to sort of back into this question. You've written and spoken of the logic of Russian meddling in the U.S. and other Western elections. On the Atlantic website last month, I wrote down that you said, Putin has shown his people that maybe the West isn't that great. It's chaotic, it's unpredictable, it's unstable. Maybe the Russian way isn't that bad. Maybe it's even better than the American way. So let me ask you, is there any doubt about the fact of Russian meddling in our election? And if it is a fact, was this about changing the election's outcome, or changing America's standing in the world, or in a strange way bolstering Putin's standing in his own country? 12 questions packed into one.
So, even Putin himself said that there may have been Russians who hacked, meddled, whatever. They just didn't have Russian guidance. And this has been the Russian official line all along, is that maybe there were some hackers, 400-pound guys in New Jersey sitting in their beds who did some hacking, but we have nothing to do with it. And they might be telling the truth. A lot of hackers that work for the FSB and the GRU are freelancers. And
they're overweight. No.
And what?
I said they're overweight.
Yes, and they're overweight. They simply can't come into work. It's too hard. So, I'm not an intelligence specialist. I can't say, 100%. We have the American intelligence community's assessment. We have CrowdStrike's assessment, which is the private company brought in by the DNC to assess the hacks. We have other assessments. I don't understand computer science, even though my father is a computer programmer, like all Russian Jews. I have, it seems like they did, but I can't walk you through a forensic detailed analysis. What we do know is that the Russians have been doing lots of things. It's kind of, as one former Obama official put it to me, it's throwing spaghetti at the wall and seeing what sticks. And they have taken a very varied approach, and it's been creeping from east to west for years and years and years. It started with Estonia and Georgia and Ukraine, and then Eastern Europe, then Western Europe, and of course, eventually it hopped, as all epidemics do, hopped the Atlantic and got on our shores. And in fact, actually, the intelligence community assessment that came out in the winter said that the illegals, I don't know if you remember, redhead Anna Chapman. Do you remember that? Like every American man suddenly had a crush on this Russian spy. Kicked out in 2010, they were, this is what the Americans are based on, these illegals living in deep undercover in the US. Apparently they were here to spy on the 2008 presidential election, according to the US intelligence community. So they've been nibbling around the edges. They've been trying different things. I just think the thing where I would disagree with a lot of American assessments of this, like kind of popular imagination about this, is that the Russians don't put together very elaborate, detailed plans. A lot of things are more improvisational than we realize. A lot of things are more opportunistic than we realize. They're trying lots of different things at once, and we only hear about the things that work. A lot of it has to do with the fact that the Obama administration badly bungled its response to the hacking and the interference as it was happening. A lot of it is the fact that our system is the way it is, and the Russians are weaponizing the system's openness, relative openness at least, against ourselves. So there's a lot of factors at play, and it's not just that the Russians are perfect, detail-oriented villains. They're not. If you talk to any Russian, they're like, "You really think we are capable of doing this? Look at our roads. Look at our hospitals. Like we can't do anything right." And you think that that our hackers are so amazing. One very high-ranking member of the United Russia Party, which is Putin's party, after throwing his Hermes coat down on the cafe bench and complaining to me about how hard life is in Paris. By the way, this is a big difference between the Soviet Union and contemporary Russia. Most of the families of the elites don't live in Russia. They live in Europe, they study in Europe, their wives and kids are all there. All the money goes to where they live. Which is why the health and educational infrastructures are crumbling. Anyway, so he was saying nothing here works, but suddenly our hackers work. Don't you think our country would look different if we could even get this thing to work? Or that the world would look different if Russian hackers were this good? So the Russians don't even believe this because they have their own weird insecurities about themselves and who they are and what their capabilities are.
So if it happened, it wasn't necessarily organized? It didn't necessarily have intent?
No, I'm saying, no, that's what I'm saying.
And the motivation would have been therefore what?
No, I'm saying there could have been intent, there could have been organization. It's just not in the way we think, where Putin sits down, writes up an elaborate plan, says, here, you do this, you do this, you do this, check back in with me periodically. Putin often builds in plausible deniability on a lot of things and says, like, you know, this is the general direction we're going, and he sends out a signal, and the giant bureaucratic state under him, level by level, the signal drips down, and people interpreted it and try to kind of please their immediate boss, who tries to please their immediate boss. So it gets very messy.
I think we have time for a
if I
couple,
could just
please.
say for the record, though,
Please,
that this is one of those issues. It's sort of like you either think it happened
Right.
or you're living in
Are there
an
facts?
you're living in an
Is there
alternative
evidence?
facts world. And I think it's just been clear from a pattern of Russian behavior
Mm-hmm.
from the people who study the forensics of Russian active measures and information operations and cyber operations around the world that this fits squarely within the playbook. And what's audacious about it was not that it happened, not that there are hackers collecting political intelligence, but the fact that they dumped it into the public with an intent. And the intent originally was to discredit our democracy and to make us look foolish, to make us seem off balance, to discredit what they expected to be a Clinton administration coming into power in January 2017. And at some point that tipped. It tipped into, I think we can, in a very competitive, close American election, engineer an outcome that will be better for Russia. And that's different. That is something new. And it's shame on us that our systems were vulnerable. They remain very vulnerable to this kind of activity. And people are really worried. And you've now seen a pattern of subsequent Russian activities in the French election. The new Director of National Intelligence, Senator Coates, Ambassador Coates spoke about this the other day, that there's worries about the German elections and even the British elections. So this is real, and we should just acknowledge it. We shouldn't, I think, hide under the table, but we shouldn't pretend that we need to show people the facts. And the reason we're not going to see the facts, in part, has to do with the sensitivity of how that information is collected. And the minute you start presenting it, you will give adversaries the opportunity to reverse engineer what we know. So I just want to be really careful with folks to not suggest that this is all questionable.
There's some question.
Right.
No,
It's not.
I completely
It's-
agree
yeah.
with Andrew. I'm not talking about it did happen. I'm not talking about whether it happened, but about how it happened, to what extent we were vulnerable, to what extent this was as organized as we think it is, as opposed to opportunistic and evolving. But yeah, it definitely
Okay,
happened.
that's clear.
Yeah.
Okay, we have time for a couple of questions. Yes, please.
I have a question.
Are there microphones, or how does this work? No? Yes?
We were just discussing
just
that
shout.
there are no facts about it. And then you're saying you either believe in it or not. You have to believe in facts. If there are no facts, what is your belief based on? Repeat the question.
So the question was that for people to just present the idea of Russian interference and say you either believe it or you don't in the absence of facts. The facts are there. Russian involvement in our political process was very noisy. You had a series of activities, and if you go back and you read the accounts sort of blow by blow, and I can give you a couple of examples.
And they weren't really trying to hide it either.
Exactly. So you had, in the sort of 2014, 2015 period, a series of cyber attacks, including against the German parliament, the Bundestag. Forensically,
I'm talking about the
I understand, but just bear with me for a second, because the facts, the pattern of this, the mosaic of this matters. The computers that were used to control the malware on the computers installed in the Bundestag, the German parliament, during the hack in 2015, are the same signature and the same pattern as the malware that was used
That's been
against
withdrawn. That's been withdrawn.
DNC.
CrowdStrike withdrew that
The
3 weeks ago.
The Russian hackers who went out and tried to break into the email accounts of senior Democratic Party political officials did not disguise the password they used on a website called Bitly. And people can now pull up the list of all the targets. They can see who the Russian hackers were attacking. All of this information, just take two of those little examples, is out there. The thing that we don't have from the US intelligence community is a dossier or a set of, like a criminal indictment. But if you go and you look at, for example, an indictment that was handed down in California about 3 months ago for Russian involvement in the hack of Yahoo's email system, you will see very much a picture similar to what Julia described, which is commercial/criminal groups working at the behest of the Russian intelligence services to break into Yahoo's email to the tune of millions of accounts. So all this stuff is out there, And then on top of that, you have this kind of giddy Russian public face where Putin sort of repeatedly during the campaign was saying, it doesn't matter who hacked it, wink, wink. What really matters is the salaciousness of the disclosures. And you've seen this kind of throughout the past 6 months. So it's not like the Russian government has run away from the allegation. What they fall back on is, show us the facts. Until you sort of can prove this in a legalistic form, we're not going to take responsibility. And that's normal practice for an intelligence agency to not run up and take credit for the things they've done. Like that, you wouldn't expect to see the Russian government spiking it in the end zone and saying, yeah, you caught us, but we're really psyched
They
about
do
the
as
result.
much of that as they can. And Putin, by the way, last week said, there were Russian hackers who did this, but they were patriotically minded artists, and who knows how they feel in the morning when they get up and they go and do their hacking. But notice he said they didn't have kind of Kremlin direction. But notice he said patriotically minded, that a Russian who was patriotically minded would know that this was his or her patriotic duty to go and do, right? So that's one point. The other point is they did spike it in the end zone as much as they could. They did kind of show their traces. I've lost my train of thought, but yeah, I think Andrew's quite right.
Sorry.
Thank you. Sergei Lagodinsky from Berlin. Maybe we should focus on facts below the threshold of hacking and look at what's happening in Europe. And it's open and it's into your face. There is a war in media on European liberal democracy model, and there is an open support for all forces who are against European Union and against liberal agenda of parties. The German Alternative for Germany, the youth organization, has an alliance with the youth organization of Putin party. Marine Le Pen got the credits. Nobody even denies it. You yourself are always on Russia Today, which is is an out interface, a hatred campaign against the West, the United States, and Europe. So how do you deal with this? I hope I did not malpractice now, but I'm sure about my facts. So how do you deal with these facts, and how it's not about hacking, it's about into your face propaganda.
Professor, thank you.
Anybody know why Jews have such short necks? I mean, this guy says he doesn't malpractice. If we're going to do facts, Andrew's wrong. German intelligence, at Merkel's request, did an investigation of whether or not Russia was unduly interfering in German politics. Unduly meaning...
Only in secret services, but not the media. They said...
You going to ask your question and answer it?
Well, you don't answer my question.
I'm trying. And unduly means, and we should all ask this, are the Russians doing anything that we don't do and haven't done for years, and they haven't done for years? I mean, are we all born yesterday? I mean, we've been meddling in Russia's political process and elections. I don't even know what meddle means anymore. If Andrew means that they do broadcasts, as RT, that are subversive out of their Washington bureau, I mean, which the three intelligence agencies, and Brennan admitted, and so did Clapper, it wasn't 17, it was 3, and they handpicked the analysis to cook that report they published in January. And Andrew says now, well, they can't tell us everything because it's classified. That's what they told John Kennedy when they asked him why the Bay of Pigs went wrong, and they asked Johnson when they told him why Tonkin went wrong, and what they told us when it turned out Saddam didn't have any weapons of mass destruction. I mean, this is a long story. Do we have to be born yesterday? Can we bring to this some discussion? So, when Comey testifies, when is it, Thursday? Somebody please ask him, because there are no forensics, Andrew, why the FBI didn't do the forensics on the DNC computer, but allowed Clinton to say, no, we've got our own organization called CrowdStrike. Now, I live in New York City. That would be like there's a mass murder in New York City, and the New York Police Department hires a private dick to do the investigation. Why didn't Comey do the forensics? It's a simple question. There are no forensics because CrowdStrike's report has fallen apart. Jeffrey Carr, maybe our #1 computer expert, who hates both Putin and Trump, said something very smart. If all signs point to Russia, Russia didn't do it. Expert hackers don't leave fingerprints. Andrew says they left a fingerprint. They left the name Dzerzhinsky. You know who Dzerzhinsky was? He was the founder of the Soviet secret police. And yet we're told these are super hackers. Oh, but they left their wallet there with their ID card in it. This is bunk. We want facts. We want facts.
Professor,
One last point. For Julia, and you know, everybody, some people think abortion's the #1 essential threat to the world. Some people think climate change is the #1 essential threat. We all have a #1 essential threat. For me, it's international terrorism, because I remember 9/11. Have we all forgotten that? I know we have subways we can't protect. Maybe we could protect the planes now, but we can't protect our ports. We can't protect our trains. We can't protect our sports and rock arenas. We cannot do that. And here's the point. These guys, Julia says they don't have any nukes. These guys are desperately in search of radioactive material. The French police thought they were close in France. Radioactive material is all over the world. There's too much of it around the former Soviet states. If they get radioactive material and they put it in an explosive at Yankee Stadium, you won't be able to go to that area for a decade. If there had been radioactive material at the Twin Towers, the whole of lower Manhattan would not be inhabitable today. This is a new terrorism, and once they get this stuff and they're ready to attach it to their explosives, so for me that's existential.
Professor, thank you.
She agrees with Senator McCain that Russia's #1. To me, this is myopic folly, but this is what we should debate.
Professor, thank you. We have no more
Excuse
time
me.
for questions, but I do want to ask Julia and Andrew just to give us 30 seconds of response, and then we're going to have to close. Julia, if you can.
It's just, I've said it, I still don't think, you know, there's a difference between a radioactive dirty bomb and a whole arsenal of nukes and the means to deploy them effectively as opposed to a dirty bomb. There's a difference between horrible, bloody, chaotic, a few dozen or even a few thousand deaths and existential threat. That is a very different threshold.
Thank you. Thank you. Andrew.
No, I just wanted to thank our colleague from Europe for bringing up the sort of overt aspects of this. That this is, you know, very much on display. It's very effective in a world in which the news media, traditional news media, are sort of breaking down, and people are very much just enthralled to the information in our Facebook and our Twitter feeds. So we're in a world now where all these tools are there. The Russians have done, I think, a very good job of kind of making use of them. We shouldn't over-dramatize how dangerous they are, but at the same time, I think we do need to kind of wise up, and we're in a new world where these tools matter.
Thank you. Andrew, Julia, Steve, thank you very much. Thank you all.